guys, welcome back. If you're new here, my name is Becca and today I'm going to be talking about my 2021 reading statistics. So this is my final video in my wrap up of 2021. Gonna give you a little warning that this video is one for the nerds, for the people who love statistics as much as I do. This is more of a documentative video than really an informative video. It's gonna show you how my reading went in 2021 in terms of stats, the genres, the formats. I've also compared these statistics with my statistics for the year of 2020. So where applicable or where it's relevant and a little bit interesting, I will be highlighting any significant increases and decreases in the various statistics and reflecting on what that means for me as a reader and how my reading has changed and evolved throughout the year of 2021. Before we get started, I get a lot of questions about my specific reading spreadsheet, where I got it, will I share it, all of that stuff. My reading spreadsheet is not really mine. It is an amalgamation of a ton of other reading spreadsheets, which is why I don't share mine for you guys to use. If you would like a spreadsheet that is similar to mine, the base of mine and the core of mine is from Ali from Hardback Hoarder's 2019 spreadsheet, but I've also spliced a page from her 2020 spreadsheet. She made one in 2021 that is like super in depth and super in detail, so you can go and check that one out. And then the other main addition to my spreadsheet is that I use G from Bookrush rating system, which is called Core Pile, where you break down the books you read and rate them on individual components, and together it gives you like an average which converts to a rating. So I will link G's Core Pile video because she's just posted a new one, and I will also see if I can find a link to Ali's 2021 spreadsheet as well to link for you guys, so that if you are looking for a spreadsheet of your own that will give you similar statistics to mine, then you can do so. I will say that I don't use any of the stats from G's. I've just copied and pasted the formulas for Core Pile into mine, so I use the rating system. But like G's spreadsheet has a whole lot more that I don't use because I already have my own full spreadsheet that I've been tailoring a little bit over the years. So let's crunch some numbers. We'll start off with something real basic, which is my Goodreads goal. My Goodreads goal for 2021 was 108 books, and I read 117 in total. So once again, we're really going up there. I'm reading more and more every year. I set my Goodreads goal as one more book than what I read previously. I'm in a bit of a weird situation right now because I think I'm reading too much. I don't want to read 118 books in a year. It's a lot, and you'll see when I get to my goals video, which I think is going to be the video that directly follows this one, that I'm having a little bit of shift in priorities. It won't affect my content really or anything. It's just I want to do some things differently. So it's not in my nature to fail. So I don't know what I want to do about my Goodreads TBR, because if I did fail, my Goodreads goal would come down. But I don't want to fail. I'm just going to do what I normally do. I don't normally strive for this number. I normally end up ahead of my Goodreads goal. But obviously as it gets bigger every year, it's harder for me to stay ahead. So we'll just see what happens. But I won't be mad if I fail it in 2022 is what I'm saying, although I will be a little bit because I don't like to fail. For the pages I read in 2021, I read 43,840 pages, which is 1,978 more than I read in 2020. I read a lot of big books, which adds to my page count, but we have had a decrease in average page length this year, because my average page length per book for 2021 is 374 pages, which interestingly is one more page than my average book length for 2019, but comparing it to 2020, it is nearly 20 pages left, because my average book length for 2020 was 391. But in 2020 I was reading like the Stormlight Archive. The Robin Hood books we were reading were skewing a bit larger in 2020. I'm not sure what the short things are that I've been picking up. I have read more comics though than I did in 2020, which you will see very soon. In terms of the type of books that I've read, this is like a weird category. You will notice the arcs are on this graph as well, and I don't use this part of my spreadsheet to track arcs in. So this is essentially split into standalone, series and rereads. I haven't reread any books in 2021, which is weird for me, but I mainly reread in preparation for anticipated releases. And in 2021 there were no sequels to things that I really loved coming out where I felt I needed to reread. It's already going to be different in 2022 because I'm going to reread House of Earth and Blood soon, so that's why there's no rereads at all. But I did only have 3 in 2020. 2020. So the split on standalone versus series really isn't different. I always expect series to come in at about 75%. I mainly read fantasy, which goes hand in hand with reading series, but we do have a 3% increase on series this year and a 1.6% decrease on standalone, so it really is like negligible numbers there. In terms of the amount of books that I read per month, I did hit my best reading month ever, like the most I'd read in a month ever this year, and that was for July. But surprisingly, that's not the month that I read the most amount of books. It is high, but it wasn't the most. The month that I read the most amount of books was March. My best month in terms of pages was definitely July, and I 100% pay more attention to pages than the amount of books read, and I read 4,855 pages. In terms of the amount of books read, my worst months were April and December. Now this December is actually the best December that I've ever had, because traditionally I don't read as much in December. I'm real busy, and then we have holidays and like social obligations, all of that kind of stuff. But I did really well this December, but still didn't read too much. But 3 of the books I think that I read were over 600 pages as well. And in terms of pages read, the worst month was June. I read a whole ton of short stuff in June and things that were like light and distracting for the most part, because it just was not a good month for me personally. It was the month that Hamilton was injured and was really ill. In terms of ratings, you guys will have heard me say countless times over the last couple of months that ratings just have not been great for me over 2021, and I still don't know whether it's because I read a lot more now, so I'm a lot pickier about what I will give 5 stars to and rate highly, or whether the books that I'm picking are just not the books that I should be picking up and reading. But we only had 25 stars in total, which is 8 less than in 2020. The amount of 4 stars was pretty much exactly the same. I read 1 more 4-star book. I had 8 more 3 stars, 7 more 2 stars, but I did have 2 less 1 stars. There was no 1-star reads in 2021. If we break this down into like good ratings and bad ratings, I use 3 stars as like, I liked it, it was good, but it didn't leave a lasting impression on me. 2 stars is normally, I don't think it's terrible, it just didn't gel with my personal taste, and 1 star is just like, I just really did not like this, there were multiple things wrong with it, I don't understand how somebody else could give this 5 stars, because it was just so opposite from anything that I can enjoy. So if we split it into 4 and 5 stars versus 3 and below, I had 44 books at 3 stars and under this year, whereas in 2020 I only had 31. So definitely a lot more lower ratings than higher ratings this year. In 2022, all I'm hoping for is more 5-star reads, and once again when we get to my setup videos for 2022, so like my goals, I'm gonna try my best to know when to give up on what I should give up on and prioritize the things that I actually think I'm gonna love. For the demographics, we actually had a considerable shift in 2021 that was completely just not a conscious decision made by me when I was choosing what I was reading, but I think it's very obvious that over the years I have been shifting towards more adult. Now my original aim when I wanted to move my reading in this direction was to have it about 50-50, so I was reading an equal amount of adult and young adult. Obviously this doesn't take into account the fact that I also read like new adult and middle grade, although they are always much smaller percentages. But in 2021, 58% of the books that I read were adult, which is a 17% increase on 2020, and young adult I have a 12% decrease on, so I'm really just moving away from young adult. When you think about that, you would actually expect my average ratings to be going up, but I do read a lot of indie fantasy romance, which we will see a little bit later in this video, and it is possible that because romance I feel like is very much down to personal taste, maybe I'm just not picking up the indie romance because you don't know until you've read it. I feel like a lot of the indie romance could be bringing my ratings down a little bit, because when I love it, but if I don't love it, I tend to be very ambivalent towards it, and it'll definitely get like 2-3 stars. For new adult, we only have a 2% increase. New adult is something that I pretty much only started reading in 2020. They'll continue to read about the same amount in 2021. And middle grade, I read 7% less. I didn't do very well with Believeathon this November, and I think in 2020 Gav did 2 rounds of Believeathon. I also really love the Nevermore series. I read all of that's published so far in 2020, and there was not a new release in that series in 2021, so there will be like, that will add to the discrepancy. Middle grade I don't read a whole ton of. I do want to read a little bit more of it though, because I do enjoy it as like a nice refresher and to give me those uplifting feels, so it's definitely something I will try and work into my reading a little bit more, especially because Gav stopped doing Believeathon now. I can't lean on Believeathon to make me read middle grade. It's going to have to be something that I make a conscious effort to do. For the formats, we don't have too much of a change here. I read 2% more physical books, which just means that I own them, they're in my collection, they're not an arc or a manga or a comic, than I did last year. But I mean, that's a very small percentage. It's still working out at about the same. The only real significant change for this year is that only 7.7% of the books that I've read are ebooks, and that is a 7% decrease on 2020. I am trying to prioritize my physical collection, but as the physical books haven't gone up, I think it's just anything that isn't a standard physical book. It very much is dependent on the book, on what format I'm reading it in. Like, there's some books that I read in audio, but like there's very few of them. The only thing that I read a substantial amount of is standard physical books, and I did read 3% less manga this year, but 5% more comics. So I went back. I know last year I didn't read very many comics at all, and I've gone back to comics a little bit more, but still very small percentages of my overall reading. For the genres, this is a little bit of an interesting one, but also it's very easily explainable. I'm normally a minimum of 50% fantasy, normally around the 55% mark, which makes perfect sense because the majority of books that I read are fantasy. It's my favorite genre. However, this year we only have 39% fantasy, which is actually a 16% decrease on 2020. However, I did say in my stats video that as I was getting more into fantasy romance and it was contributing a significant amount of books to the amount that I'm reading, that I was going to start tracking fantasy romance separately. Even though I don't usually track subgenres, fantasy romance is something I read a lot of. So 16% of the books that I read in 2021 were fantasy romance. I was previously tracking fantasy romance as fantasy, so that fantasy romance portion just immediately explains why the amount of fantasy I read was 16% less. The only other significant change here is that romance has gone up 11% on 2020, and it is exactly equal with fantasy romance. 2021 was the year that I discovered contemporary romance. Romance has been a slow, I want to say like a slow landslide. I started off reading a little bit of fantasy romance, that's just growing year on year, and now I'm definitely leaning into a position where I'm almost 50-50 fantasy and romance, with obviously fantasy romance in there as well, because if you combine romance and fantasy romance, it's accounting for 32% or 33% when you add the decimal percentages of all of the books that I'm reading. So a third of the books that I'm reading are romance based, just over a third of them are fantasy, and then the other third is made up of everything else. The thing that continues to surprise me on here is that only 8% of the books I've read are sci-fi. I keep calling myself predominantly fantasy and sci-fi reader. I'm not. I'm predominantly a fantasy and romance reader, but I do want to read more sci-fi. It might be something that I'm going to have to make a conscious effort to do. I love sci-fi when I read it, I just apparently never pick it up. For the places where I sourced the books I read, this is pretty similar to what it usually is. I've actually just very slightly increased the amount of books that I'm reading from my own TBR or from Hold, which is essentially all of the books in my collection. Own TBR means that I had them prior to the start of the year. Hold means that they've been held in that year, but I'm reading books that I own, which is really good. So we have a 5% increase on the books in my own TBR, and we have a 3% increase on the books that I've hauled. On the opposite side of that, I'm not reading many books from outside sources that I haven't acquired myself in some way, because we have a 5% decrease on the amount of arcs that I'm reading and a 4% decrease on the books that I'm reading from NetGalley. I'm giving up on arcs. I don't really need them. There is the odd one that of course like I want to read, like I'm passionate about reading it early, but I found that arcs don't really add anything to my life in most cases. The only time that they ever add anything to my life is when I feel like other people who have arcs are ruining anticipated releases for me, because it's kind of like a, you know, we all do it, okay? If you have arcs, you get really excited and you go around and you tell everyone about how good this book is that you've read and nobody else has read yet, which is fine, but I've also noticed that hype is killing a lot of books for me. So I don't think that arcs are adding anything to my life unless there's something like a Sarah J Maas arc, which are incredibly hard to get hold of anyway. I don't need that energy in my life, so I definitely want to reduce the amount of books that I'm requesting. I currently have one arc to review for January, and I have requested one more, but I want to keep them very minimal, with the exception being books that are offered to me for review from the author directly. Any indie authors that reach out to me for fantasy romance, I do always consider if I do have the time to read them, because I do read a lot of indie books, fantasy fantasy romance books, and those are the types of books that I want to spread the word about. People who are marketing their books out of their own pocket, essentially, as opposed to publishers who put money behind what they think is going to sell, as opposed to what they think is actually good, you know. Like, I want to help indie authors grow. I think in 2022, in terms of the sources as well, the only thing that I really want to make a conscious effort to shift is I want own TBR to be bigger than hold. And when you see my goals video, you will notice that I'm going to try and do something, not a book buying ban, but with a similar kind of effect, which I will explain in that video. But hopefully that will shift the amount of books that I'm reading from my own TBR to a little bit bigger percentage, because I've got a big backlist. In terms of the books that I put on TBRs in 2021 versus books that I actually read, I TBR'd 88 books and I read 84 of them, so that's pretty good. Only 4 that I didn't read. I'm happy with that. In terms of the diversity that I'm seeing in the books that I read, it's definitely still heading in the right direction. The biggest section on here is books with multiple forms of diversity, and that is accounting for 47.9%. So that is a book that has both queer characters and mental health rep in it, things like that. And we have a 16% increase on books with multiple forms of diversity than in 2020, which is excellent. It's like what we want to see. And we do have a 4% decrease on books that have absolutely no diversity, so essentially all straight white characters. That is pretty much the biggest thing to be taken from this graph. The only thing that's really of note is that in 2021 I read more books with queer characters and I read slightly less books that had mental health rep. But of course I will have read more books with all of these types of diversity in. They will just come under the multiple category. It's just that I read less books that only had mental health rep and more books that only had queer rep in them. Something I do like to track is the relationship that I have with the authors that I'm reading from, and this comes into 3 categories. Debut is always tiny. I really like to read authors' backlists when I find authors that I like. As a series reader, they only get put into the new category the first time I read a book from them. So an example is when I started The Realm of the Eldlings, Robin Hobb went into the new category once, and I'm now up to book 11, so she's then gone into the known category 10 times. So it makes sense that known would be the biggest section on here, accounting for 58.1% of the books that I've read. The new category is at 38.5, so that is authors that I haven't read from before, but like I said, they only get put in there once, and only 3.4% are debut authors. Like I said about the hype kind of killing things for me at the moment, I feel bad that I don't read more books by debut authors. It's just, as I've been on booktube so long and I hear so many people talking about books, and I know how hype, as we discussed, mainly how much money can publishers throw at books and how many arcs they can get out there and all of that kind of stuff. I don't like to pick up new books by authors I haven't heard of anymore unless I've heard reviews. It's a little bit different when it comes to the subscription boxes that I have, because I'm trusting the people curating the boxes to provide me with books that I'm interested in. But in terms of spending my own money going out into a bookstore and what I'm picking up, I like to have heard reviews first, which is why there's not many in the debut section in here, because I don't count an author's debut book if they've published 10 books. So an example is if I was reading Cassandra Clare's first published book, she wouldn't go into debut because she's no longer a debut author, so the criteria for it to count as debut is also quite specific as well. And the final graph we are going to be looking at today is the publishers. I'm not going through this entire graph because it is enormous. The main things of note in here is that I predominantly read indie books. Obviously that's going to be a big slice because everything else is split between the specific publishers, where essentially this is just like if it's self-published it goes in this one category. But we do have an 8% increase on indie books this year, accounting for 23.9% of the books that I'm reading. Y'all know I've spoke about it in this video and many times before. I love to support indie authors, but it's wild to me that nearly a quarter of the books that I'm reading are indie authors, because it doesn't feel like that when I'm picking up books. And I think it's because indie books are getting a lot more recognition now. So I read like 4 books in the Wicked Villain series by Katie Roberts. She's a very well-known indie smutty romance author, so she's an author that's very popular and she feels like an author that's very widely known. She's not something you typically associate with self-publishing. And as usual, my other 2 most popular publishers are Harper Voyager, which accounts for 12.8% of the books that I read, and also Glanks, which is accounting for 7.7%. As we've established during this video, I predominantly read fantasy. They are Harper Voyager, I would say, is the biggest fantasy publisher in the UK. Glanks is another one. I don't know if they're the second most popular, but they do publish a lot of Sanderson, and we have had a 2% decrease on book books from Glanks that I've read in 2021, but I've read a little bit less Sanderson in 2021 than I did in 2020. Also, a couple of the chunkier slices on the pie are Orbit and Hodder, who are also fantasy publishers, and everybody else is just like pretty much the odd book, really. So there you have it. That is my nerdy little stats video. As I mentioned at the beginning of this is mainly a documentative video, really, on how my books translate into statistics and the differences on the year before and what that maybe says about me as a reader. But I do hope you've enjoyed this, even though it's more of a reflection on me than a giving information to you kind of situation. If you have, please let me know down in the comments. I know a lot of you guys are nerdy little stats fans like me, but aside from that, guys, please don't forget to like this video if you liked it and subscribe if you wanna. If you head into my description box, you'll find a link to my Goodreads, Instagram and Twitter if you'd like to follow me on any of those, as well as a link to my Bookish Candle website, the Instagram for that, and a 10% off discount code. But that's it from me today, guys. Bye.
Oh, you bite your friend like chocolate. You say you will go where nobody knows, with guns hidden under our petticoats. We're never gonna quit it, no, we're never gonna quit it, no.